In the shadow of Rome's glory, there was a weapon few dare to speak of. Not a sword, not a spear, but a living creature molded by cruelty. These were not pets, but war dogs, massive beasts trained to rip flesh from bone, to silence Rome's enemies with terror instead of words. Yet behind this brutal weapon was a truth the Empire never admitted. Those dogs weren't the only ones dehumanized, chained, and used as tools. The same system that unleashed animals on battlefields also reduced conquered people to property. What does it mean when an empire values its dogs more than its slaves? The Roman Empire is remembered as a machine of discipline, strategy, and power. Its legions were feared across the known world, marching with precision, their standards high, and their victories countless. But hidden beneath the discipline was a darker tactic. The use of war dogs, giant Molossan hounds, armored in spiked collars, unleashed against Rome's enemies to tear apart flesh and instill terror long before swords clashed. These dogs were carefully bred, trained with violence, and paraded as a symbol of Rome's might. To Roman citizens, they represented loyalty and strength. To Rome's enemies, they were nightmares on four legs. Yet, while the empire glorified these beasts, another truth lay in the shadows. Human beings, enslaved men, women, and children, were treated with the same disregard. Just like the war dogs, they were stripped of identity and turned into weapons or tools for the empire's expansion. African captives, Gauls, and countless others were forced to fight, labor, or die for Rome, their humanity erased beneath the same imperial machine that glorified animals more than human lives. To Rome, both slaves and dogs were expendable, disposable extensions of power. But while the dogs were remembered as fierce protectors of empire, the enslaved were silenced, their stories buried beneath centuries of marble monuments and triumphal arches. And it is here that the story turns chilling. When a society praises brutality in animals while erasing the humanity of entire peoples, what does that say about the foundation of its power? Picture a battlefield. The Roman legions march forward, their armor gleaming under the sun. Trumpets sound, banners wave, and then silence. From the front lines, handlers release the war dogs. The animals charge, their jaws snapping, their bodies armored with iron spikes. Enemy soldiers falter before swords are even drawn. Fear spreads faster than any spear could fly. These dogs weren't just fighters. They were psychological weapons. The Romans understood fear, and they wielded it ruthlessly. Victories weren't only won with strength but with terror, and the dogs played their part. But behind this display of power lies a haunting truth. The same cages that held the war dogs also held human beings. Enslaved Africans, brought across seas, stood chained beside animals. Both were seen as property, both trained or forced into obedience. The war dogs were made into instruments of destruction, while the enslaved were broken into submission, their lives traded in markets, their fates decided by men who saw themselves as masters of the world. What made it worse was the twisted irony. To many Roman generals, the dogs were more valued than the people they enslaved. Dogs received armor, food, and care because they were seen as vital to Rome's victories. Enslaved men and women, on the other hand, were starved, beaten, and discarded, considered replaceable in a system that thrived on conquest. And so, when the war dogs charged into battle, it wasn't only the enemy that trembled, it was also a mirror held up to Rome itself, a reflection of an empire that celebrated animals as weapons, but erased the humanity of millions of enslaved. Think of the enslaved who were forced to march with legions, watching armored dogs receive more dignity than they ever would. Think of the mothers separated from children, treated as commodities, while soldiers toasted victories bought with the suffering of both human and animal lives. The war dogs became symbols of empire, but the enslaved remained nameless, faceless, forgotten. And in that silence, Rome's most brutal secret is revealed. Not just in the use of beasts for war, but in the way it reduced human beings to less than beasts. There came moments when the cruelty collided, moments that history seldom records. In gladiatorial arenas, enslaved men were sometimes forced to fight against war dogs for public spectacle. Imagine it. A chained man thrown into the sand, staring into the snarling jaws of beasts bred to kill. The crowd roared, not in horror, but in entertainment. The empire justified it as a display of Roman superiority, Humans reduced to prey, animals celebrated as weapons. It wasn't about victory. It was about erasing dignity, reminding the enslaved and to conquer their place in the order Rome created. This was Rome's darkest truth. War dogs and enslaved humans shared the same fate, not as beings with worth, but as tools of terror. And in those arenas, the line between human and animal blurred, both treated as pawns in a game of domination. Here lies the heart of injustice. When a society decides who is human and who is not, cruelty becomes tradition and brutality becomes glory. The war dogs of Rome have faded into history. Their bones lie forgotten, their legacy remembered only in fragments of ancient writings. But the enslaved, the millions whose lives were stolen, remain an open wound in the memory of human history. Rome's brutality reminds us of something dangerous. When power dehumanizes, when people are reduced to tools, the cycle of oppression feeds itself. The dogs may have been Rome's fiercest weapon, but the true weapon was fear, and fear was always aimed at the vulnerable. This story is not just about ancient history. Across centuries, the same pattern repeats. From Rome to the transatlantic slave trade, to modern systems of inequality, oppressed people are stripped of humanity, while empires glorify their tools of violence. The war dogs are a haunting metaphor, living proof of how easily a society can choose to value control over compassion. And if an empire as mighty as Rome could collapse, built on the suffering of the voiceless, what does that teach us about the empires of today? So we ask, in our world now, who is being treated as less than human? And when history looks back on us, will it say we chose justice or cruelty disguised as power?